Paris Perspective.
Hello and welcome to this edition of Paris Perspective with me, David Coffey. Well, France's far-right leader Marine Le Pen has doubled down on backing closer ties between NATO and Russia. If she were to win the French presidency, Ms. Le Pen says Paris would leave the integrated command of the US-led alliance. Once the war in Ukraine comes to an end, she says there should be a strategic rapprochement between NATO and Russia, essentially withdrawing the only EU nuclear power from the command structure of the military alliance of some 30 individual countries. Now, on Paris Perspective today, I'm joined by political analyst and active member of US Republicans in France, Robert James Oliver. Great to have you on the program today.
Great to see you, David. Thank you for the invitation. And we haven't seen each other since pre-pandemic. So it's great to see you. Great to see you healthy.
And we're both doing well after it, indeed. Now, it has been quite a while since we last touched base. Now, before we dive into the nitty-gritty of our subject today, let's have a quick look into how Washington, we're going to be looking into how Washington would react to such a move of France pulling out of NATO. But what exactly is the current status of the relationship between Paris and Washington? Now, this all comes 8 months after the AUKUS submarine debacle. How are things going between Macron and Biden at the moment?
Seems to be going pretty well. By everyone's opinion. We just had just a few months ago the Vice President Kamala Harris visiting Paris. I unfortunately got stuck in that traffic. It was a nightmare, but I know she was here. I think it seems to be very good relationships, and the relationships aren't necessarily between the countries as much as they are the individuals running them and the personalities that are involved. So you have somebody like Biden who is not at all that offensive now in his advanced age, although he was kind of rebarbative when he was younger and defending himself against the plagiarism. The plagiarism calls that they were giving him when he was running, I think it was 1988. So he was a much tougher, grittier fighter then, and he's kind of lost it now, and I think that's pretty much his age. But he seems to get along well with Emmanuel Macron, and so does Kamala Harris. The personality of Donald Trump was a little bit different. Donald Trump got along with people who got along with him, and anybody else, it's get out of my way. Yeah, so it's different.
Indeed. And Macron, he did try and wine and dine Donald Trump on the Eiffel Tower and really show him exactly what a personality like Donald Trump expected when he was being welcomed here. But speaking of Trump himself, many expected a massive reset in relations between, traditional European allies and the White House when Biden took over from Donald Trump when he was elected, should I say, back in November of 2020. But that didn't really happen, did it? So there really has been kind of a maintaining of the status quo when it comes to foreign policy since Biden took over. Am I right?
I would agree with you on that, and I wouldn't say it's the exact status quo that happened before he was elected. I think the relationship is a bit warmer than it was, and I would say that that's because of the personalities that are involved. The United States has come out of a long period of apologizing to the rest of the world for everything that was imagined by the rest of the world, that was perceived by the rest of the world as to be something that the U.S. should have to apologize for. And indeed, politically in the United States, there are those who want the U.S. to apologize for so many things going back 100 years, 150 years to things like slavery and things of this nature, when slavery, in fact, was also exacerbated by the slave traders here in Europe. If it wasn't for the slave traders in Europe, there would have been no slavery in the United States. They didn't come over with boats and attack Africa. They came to England and Nantes in France and bought slaves that were taken from colonies. So you have this, that's just a little side issue. So you have this going back to Obama, and even I would say Clinton, of this apologetic nature, which for many years was to the detriment of the the average working class man, the unionist who was lost his job to Mexico or China, and especially losing jobs to Mexico as part of NAFTA, which Obama promised to renegotiate on the campaign trail, and 3 weeks after his swearing in said, no, I'm not going to do that. You have things like that people are now in the U.S., they want their jobs back. Many of them have gotten their jobs back. So they are still America first. There's still people that don't believe that they should have to give up everything for a foreign country.
And we'll pick up on a few issues indeed of from the Obama administration a little later in our conversation, and that is indeed with the current, how would you say, flexing of military muscle by Russia on the European Union's borders, and the conflict in Ukraine. But in the run-up to that conflict, to the invasion of Ukraine, there was a massive amount of shuttle diplomacy that was happening in the run-up to the invasion. The European Union, however, was quite unsettled by being sidelined by both Washington and Moscow when it came to any negotiations over what to do with Ukraine. Now, when it comes to your U.S. foreign policy, could you clear it up? Was that a calculated snub by Washington against Brussels for we don't need you guys involved, or is that just normal state of play when it comes to the United States when dealing directly with a foreign power or a foreign aggressor?
I would say it's a little bit of everything, and then going on from there, then some more. You have the European Union, which is something about 400 million people scattered through 30 states, 27 states, some sharing a currency, some not. Each state, each country, a sovereign country, having its own military force. NATO is an amalgamation of them, the similar way that they've kept their own sovereignty, each nation, unlike the United States, which is individual states under one sovereign government, under one currency that's guaranteed by the federal government, going back to Alexander Hamilton. That's what he said, and that's the only reason, really, the United States ever existed was because of this. It's a little bit different. Who guarantees the EU? What is it backed up by? So the same thing with NATO. What's backing up NATO? So you have NATO is essentially 400 million people in Europe plus 350 million in the United States. The United States being a far stronger power with atomic weapons and everything else. But NATO going back to its roots back in the late 1940s, post-World War II, to create a system essentially created by the United States so that wars would be limited to Europe. And they would be contained there. And they would be contained rather rapidly so that the U.S. would not have to get involved and lose another 100 million people or whatever the number was.
And indeed, with Marine Le Pen, as we said at the opening of our discussion today, doubling down, saying that NATO has really now been rejuvenated. I mean, only 3 years ago it was being called brain dead. It was having an existential crisis. And now Ukraine has just given it more meaning. But I mean, what would if France were to pull out of NATO and its military command, should I say? How would that wash with Washington? Now, you were mentioning there about this luggage of guilt that has been dragged by American administrations from, you could say, pre-Civil War through the Jim Crow laws through to the Civil Rights movement. But if France were to pull out, would that not reset the U.S. role as the world police? I mean, this is a role that America has been trying to shake off for years.
Well, let's get back to one thing. If France were to pull out, you mean again? Is that what you mean, David? You mean again?
Once de Gaulle actually decided to get back on board.
So Sarkozy brought them back. I believe it was Sarkozy. And so France is back in NATO. Really? Can we have our next discussion at the French NATO base here in France? Can we have our discussion there? Because I don't think we're going to find it. So, we don't know what kind of a player France is in NATO. I know that they've been very supportive militarily in terms of integration, but in actually stepping up to the plate, it's kind of questionable, I would say. It's really kind of questionable for a number of those reasons that I just stated, unlike the Norwegians, which are very much into it and have been since the end of World War II. I was recently in Norway in September of last year and was seeing where they exercise and what they do, and they were showing me one of the fjords where they said they have sonar placed to specifically to try to catch the Russians when they sneak in. So they're a very, very strong ally, and the Norwegians all speak such great English because they go to England for NATO exercises. So you now have this. You now have a situation where Europe is forced to defend Europe with the backing of NATO once again, and you're now seeing exactly what so many people have said from what I've read in the media, that this whole thing is backfiring on Putin. Rather than weaken Europe, he's actually strengthened it with NATO, with countries that never before wanted to be in NATO, like Finland, actually speaking about it.
And Sweden now, and Sweden, re-looking,
And that horrible word which they used to use, the Finlandization of a country, meaning it's just, like a stepchild to a greater power and taking its orders without being invaded. So you see that they have an 830-mile border with Russia. So you see this as something that is it's a step in the right direction if you want to see more European-led NATO.
And the Finns have got quite a reputation behind them when it comes to confronting the Russians to their side. They've got some pretty incredible and astute commanders, and they know how to work their way in the snow. But now looking, maybe just refocusing back away from NATO now, Marine Le Pen is, facing off with Emmanuel Macron this weekend. There has been a slight media silence from the Le Pen side of things. She wants to get her ducks in a row before debates and things like that. But let's just look forward to the actual vote itself, and next week when the result has been declared. If Le Pen unseats Macron, it's still very tight. Now, they say the gap is widening, but that could happen, politics, short times, etc., etc. But if she unseats Macron in the second round of the presidential election on the 24th of April, how will her rise to power be greeted by the Biden administration, who unseated, let's just say, a populist who had very similar traits to herself?
Well, I don't know how similar Trump and Le Pen are, to tell you the truth. I'm not sure she will unseat Macron, but if she does, you still have a Congress, you still have a parliament here in France, and you have a very strong parliament. So it's kind of doubtful she'll get everything she wishes for, but she will scare the daylights out of people for a while. She will very much scare the daylights out of people. What she can do politically would remain to be seen. Her image is not a good one in the world, and it's partially her negative image is exacerbated by the media. The media is very much against her. And what was that quote we said? If the media doesn't like you, you must be doing something.
It was from our colleagues from RFI in French who are down in Florida at the moment, which is obviously a big Trump stronghold. That's where Mar-a-Lago is, and she was coming out, one of the few Trump supporters who actually looks, I would say, outside of their own constituency, let alone their own country, who actually said, oh, well, with Le Pen, the quote is, if the media hates you, you're probably doing something right. So that's pretty much it. But I mean, would Le Pen being in the center of the European, this is France is one of the founding members, central parts of the European Union, does this have any impact on, let's just say, the Trumpist faction of the Republican Party in the running up to midterm elections that are slated for this November? Do people take foreign policy, or who could be their ally, outside of the US as being something they can use as a political tool to gain ground on the ground in the United States?
That's an excellent topic. So you have to create the divide between the politicians and the people running Washington and the average person, the average guy in the street. So when you start to talk about the average guy in the street, they don't know anything about French politics, basically. They know what they read in the newspapers. So they will read, if you ask them to read a newspaper and then ask them a question like, who is the extreme right candidate in France? And they'll say Marine Le Pen. And then if you ask them who is the extreme left candidate, if there were any, they would say, I don't know, because the media hasn't declared anybody to be extreme left. There's only according to the media, according to you guys, there's only the extreme right. There does not exist an extreme left. I don't know why. I guess that's people in the center, maybe.
We covered that, I can guarantee you. We have the archives.
Okay,
we did.
Okay, I'll look that up back in 1933. Yeah. But anyway, getting you there. But anyway, so the average guy in the street understands France from a perspective when there's an issue, is France on our side or not on our side? And if you remember back in when the U.S. was going into Kuwait and France was not supportive of it, there were people in the United States, this was back around 2000, I think 2002.
You mean into Iraq?
Into Iraq, I'm sorry, right. When
Second
Iraq,
Gulf War,
the Second Gulf War, I'm sorry. And there were people that, when France didn't support the U.S. on that one, thank you for correcting me on that. There were people, I remember, in front of the French embassy on Fifth Avenue pouring bottles of French wine down the drain. Yeah. And we were laughing because I was at some of my friends, and we were all taking a French class then at Alliance Francaise. We walked past them on the way to class, and we were laughing because we said, these people are so stupid. They already bought the wine. Why didn't they just drink it and not buy any more, if that's the statement they're trying to make? But this is the average man in the street. So their take on France is France with us when we have something to do, or are they against us? Mm-hmm. And that's basically that. And then you have the elitists. And elitist meaning, I mean that in every positive sense. I remember back in 1970, I think it was 74, Lionel Trilling was speaking at Columbia, and he was giving a speech on elitism and how it's a good thing because it fosters, perfectionism and quality and things of this nature. So you have the elitists. Basically, I'm talking about people who are highly educated and people that I know. For example, like Nick Dungan, who's on the Atlantic Council and was the former head of the French American Foundation, and he knows very well about politics. He teaches now at Sciences Po, where he graduated, so he can speak to these issues and understand them very succinctly, and not looking at it from, is France a friend of the United States or not? People also in the media, like Florence Fabricant, who I know has the Medal of Chevalier here. She's the former food critic of the New York Times. She might still be writing. And she knows France very well because she studied here, and writes about France completely, in books and articles in the Times. These people understand the politics. They understand the transatlantic alliances.
But these are the educated class that you're talking about.
Pay attention to what's going on here.
So indeed, now I think who you're bringing up and who you're talking about and who you're describing there are commentators. They're educated, be they liberal or conservative. Right. But let's just say some of the liberal commentators now who've been coming out have been kind of looking at the statistics of Le Pen and how she's very much closed her gap between Macron, especially in comparison to 2017, questioning the rise of her popularity and asking the question, did France not learn anything from the roughshod populism of the last 4 years of Donald Trump? And what would the reply to be to that?
Well, if take that for what it's worth, and then add to that people like Nigel Farage. So I heard him speak last year in April or May or March, I forget when it was, down in Florida. He was speaking at an event, and you look at Nigel, who was all for the Brexit, and I asked him a question. I said, "So if you're against these amalgamations of states and countries," I said, "are you all for Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland leaving the United Kingdom?
Go their separate ways."
And he had, of course, he didn't answer that question directly. He just said, "Miss Salmon in Scotland will never do that. She talks blah 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 blah." But so you see this kind of similarity. Will Marine Le Pen actually pull France out of? I think her popularity. I spend a lot of time in the South, in Sète. I spent a lot of time in that region every summer for 3 months. She's very popular in the South, more so. And it's an immigration issue, the same thing as it was in Britain.
They're coming up from Spain. I mean, it's coming through Marseille. It's the migrants coming over the mountains. I mean, that's and
this xenophobia is everywhere. I mean, it's in the UK. I mean, that was really, from what everybody's told me, the reason about Brexit was they just didn't want foreigners coming in from Europe. But England is a part of Europe, and we have it in the States. America is America is Canada, and North America is Mexico. And we don't have many Canadian people coming across the border, but we certainly have quite a few coming from Mexico, and many of them aren't even Mexicans.
Well, the Mexicans, one can say, are the backbone of the U.S. economy. I mean, we look at what happened in Britain, where there were no more drivers left have to get the produce delivered on time. I mean, let's just say I think we could both agree that it was a very poorly or ill-conceived concept from the beginning. They didn't think it out, and they didn't know what the repercussions would be for the deliveries, for Northern Ireland, the famous Northern Ireland Protocol, and of course the effect that it has for like outlets of British outlets that are on the European continent, such as Marks and Spencer. I mean, we've talked about this before, but we'll move on a little from this. We will talk about the election and all that, but I want to get back to something. When it comes to Russia and what we're living at the moment, and now one could say the revitalization of the importance of NATO. But under the Obama administration, one of his contenders for the election, one of his opponents was Mitt Romney, the Utah Senator Mitt Romney, who himself is a practicing Mormon, who is very much an old school, straight down the line GOP, dyed-in-the-wool Republican with good family values, etc. He's not very far. He'd be very far from the populism of the last 5 years of that we saw with the rise of Donald Trump in 2016. But he was lampooned. Mitt Romney was lampooned by the Obama administration for his fixation on Russia as an adversary over the threat posed by China. And now we all know that the mantra that got Trump just to the top of the Republican Party, let alone the presidency, was 3 words: China, China, China. Now here we are in 2022. And it appears now that Mitt Romney has been vindicated. I mean, how has that been received in the United States?
It's mixed. Mitt Romney's personality wasn't far from Nixon's. He was kind of a stiff. He was kind of a stiff, and he just didn't have the warmth to really warm people up. Nixon was popular at the time because of the Vietnam War and the economy. But, Mitt Romney was always appeared to me and to so many people as just a stiff and out of touch with people. He just didn't seem to have the resonance. And history can vindicate people as to what they've said, plus or minus, and pro or con. And you see this in people like Winston Churchill, also going back to pre-World War II. It could have happened anywhere. I mean, the writing was on the wall with Russia for so many years, from when they went into Georgia, and they didn't have to go into Belarus. They just silently staged a coup there with the population and the politicians that were there, and they were rather aggressive with the Georgians. So you could have seen this coming. And then you had the annexation of Crimea during, I think it was Obama's administration in 2014. 2014 was Obama. Mm-hmm. So you see this. You see this coming. Russia and China are both they're dictatorships now. So you have to. It's very interesting because Russia and China are both perceived now as to be not just usually when you have this, like we're talking about Marine Le Pen. So we're not talking about France. We're talking about Marine Le Pen. When we talk about Russia and China, we talk about Russia and China as being part of Putin and Xi. And that is the problem, is that you've got these out of control dictators, whether it's the repression of the Uyghurs in China or any of these other groups, but the people seem to be all for it. The people seem to be behind their leaders, and that's the scary part.
Indeed it is. And now, just finally, speaking of leaders, we'll be brief here, we're running out of time, but no matter who wins the French presidential election on the 24th of April, how do you see Franco-American relations developing over the next 5 years? What are the most important things that are on the agenda, do you believe?
The most important thing is, as I've said before, is that the Americans and the average man in the street, not the elitists, but the average man in the street wants to feel that France is a partner and a friend. So I think they would be, if France actually were to, not so much to leave the European Union, because that didn't have any effect on, the Brexit had no effect on Americans. If you're going to fly on a family vacation to London, you're still going to pay in pounds whether or not England is part of the EU. So it didn't really make much of a matter to the Americans. But NATO would be something that they would pay a lot of attention to, as they did when de Gaulle took them out in the 60s. That would be a shock.
Yeah, so it is making sure that France and the US are still on the same page when it would come to tackling Russia or any threat to NATO.
Yeah, and I grew up with that. I grew up with Americans saying, France is not our friend anymore, and we liberated them. What's the matter with these people? Like they can't have their own mind and their own will.
Well, and of course, de Gaulle was there saying, "Well, it's time for you guys to leave. You've been lovely guests for the time." As always, Robert James Oliver, political analyst and active member of Republicans here in France. It was a pleasure to have you on the programme today.
Pleasure to see you again. A pleasure to be here. Thank you.
And thank you for listening and tuning in to this edition of Paris Perspective. And you will find all our previous editions of Paris Perspective on www.rfienglish.com/podcasts and indeed wherever you get your podcasts. Talk to you very soon.